Mr. Doris, you are free. Oh, the road is long, the river's wide. Since the break of dawn, I've walked here by my side. My heart stays strong, though my feet are heavy. Hold on to the story. Hold on to the glory. Ooh, of a love that always stays. Of a life that never fades. Torture, March 18, 1942. On an isolated farm in Baker County, Georgia, a federal agent knocked on the door and discovered 23 black people unaware that slavery had concluded 77 years earlier. Among them was an 84-year-old woman named May Louise, her back still bearing the scars of a whip. Born free in 1858, 7 years before abolition, she had spent her entire existence chained to land that offered freedom only in words. Agent James Mallister, a war veteran with 12 years in the Department of Justice, had looked into smuggling, murders, and Nazi conspiracies. Yet nothing could prepare him for what he would find that March afternoon as the sun scorched the red dust of rural road number 47. That farm concealed a secret which defied all America claimed to be. How was it possible, in the midst of World War II, while the nation battled tyranny overseas, that people still lived as property on American soil? The journey began 3 weeks earlier, when an anonymous letter reached the federal office in Atlanta. It was merely 6 lines, written in shaky handwriting on cheap paper. It stated that at the Turner Farm, 40 km south of Albany, men and women labored without pay, slept in locked barracks, and were beaten if they tried to flee. The letter held no return address, just a desperate plea ending with the words, "They don't know they're free." Mallister was 42 and knew the region well. He had grown up in Virginia, the son of a Methodist pastor who preached equality, yet never questioned segregation. He himself had taken years to understand the South's contradictions. That blend of hospitality and cruelty, of Sunday hymns and nighttime lynchings. But this was different. Slavery no longer existed. It couldn't exist. The 13th Amendment had guaranteed that since 1865. Still, Mallister knew the stories. He knew that in remote places, especially in the rural Deep South, white men kept black workers imprisoned through impossible debts, through threats, through violence. They called it peonage, a system where a 10 debt became a life sentence. The farmers provided food, shelter, and tools, but charged absurd prices. A pound of flour costing 15 cents in town was sold for $2 on the farm. A pair of old boots was worth a week's labor, and the workers never saw money, only numbers in an account book that always grew and never shrank. But keeping people who didn't even know about abolition. That seemed impossible, even for the South of 1942. Mallister spent 2 days investigating discreetly. He spoke with the sheriff of Baker County, a heavy-set 50-year-old named Wade Perkins, who knew the Turner Farm and insisted everything there was legal. The blacks work of their own free will, the sheriff said, chewing tobacco and spitting on his office's wooden floor. It was a fair arrangement, he insisted. The Turners were good people, attended the Baptist church every Sunday, contributed to the community. But when Mallister mentioned the anonymous letter, he saw something shift in the sheriff's eyes. A flash of concern, quick as lightning, before the mask of Southern hospitality returned to his face. At the general store in Albany, Mallister spoke with merchants. He learned the Turner Farm bought large quantities of basics: flour, beans, salted meat, lamp oil, amounts suggesting many people, yet the farm never sold cotton or corn at local cooperatives. What did they produce? Where did the harvest go? An old black man unloading trucks approached Mallister when no one was looking and whispered a single phrase before vanishing among the crates. That place is hell on earth. On the morning of March 18th, Mallister left Albany at 6000, driving his black Ford on the dirt road, cutting through abandoned cotton fields and pine forests. He carried a camera, a reel-to-reel recorder, and his Colt 1911 pistol. He had no warrant, no official authorization. Technically, he was just making a courtesy visit, following up on a routine complaint. The Turner farm lay at the end of a secondary road, snaking between low hills. It was vast, at least 1,000 acres of rolling land with scattered buildings. The main house, a 2-story structure with peeling white columns and a wide porch, dominated a small rise. Farther down, Mallister saw long, dark wooden barracks, cultivated fields, and in the distance, smoke from a chimney. There was no gate, only an open entrance. Mallister drove slowly, observing everything. He saw no one in the fields, though it was almost 800 in the morning, a time when agricultural work should be in full swing. The farm seemed strangely silent, as if holding its breath. He parked before the main house and stepped out. The heat was already intense, typical of a Georgia spring. He climbed the porch steps and knocked. He waited. He knocked again. The door opened, revealing a white man around 60, thin and tall, with gray hair combed back and cold blue eyes. He wore linen pants and a white shirt with suspenders. He did not smile. "Can I help you?" Mallister showed his identification. "James Mallister, Department of Justice. I need to speak with Mr. Harold Turner." The man studied the identification for a long moment. "I'm Harold Turner. What is this about, Agent?" "We received an anonymous complaint regarding working conditions on your property. It's standard procedure to investigate." Turner's expression did not change. "A complaint. I see. Come in, Agent Mallister. Let's talk civilly." Inside, the house was surprisingly dark and outdated. Heavy mahogany furniture, thick curtains, oil portraits of stern men on the walls. The air smelled of mold and old tobacco. Turner led Mallister to an office lined with shelves of dusty books. He sat behind a huge desk and indicated a chair for the agent. "So, someone has lied about my farm," Turner said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "That doesn't surprise me. There are people who don't like to see a white man prospering through honest work." "What exactly does this complaint allege?" Mallister kept his tone professional. "That you keep workers here against their will. That they receive no wages, that they are prevented from leaving." Turner let out a short, dry laugh. "Absurd. I run this farm according to the laws of Georgia and the United States. My workers have legal contracts. They receive accommodation, food, and medical care. If they owe money, they work to pay it off. It's that simple. I'd like to speak with some of these workers." Something changed in the air. Turner leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "By what authority, Agent? Do you have a warrant?" "I don't need a warrant to ask questions. You need a warrant for me to enter your private property beyond this house, and I suggest you get one before returning." Turner stood. "Now, if you have nothing else legal to do here, I have work waiting." Mallister also stood but did not move toward the door. "Funny you should mention the law, Mr. Turner, because peonage is a federal crime. Keeping people in servitude through fabricated debts is involuntary slavery. There are men serving 10 years in federal prison for that." Turner's lips formed a thin line. "Are you accusing me of something, Agent?" "I'm making observations, and I'll be back with a warrant." Mallister left the house feeling Turner's eyes burning into his back, but he did not go straight to the car. Instead, he walked toward the barracks. If Turner tried to stop him physically, it would be an admission of guilt. The barracks stood about 200 meters from the main house along a dirt path. They were 4 long, low structures built with time, weathered boards and rusted zinc roofs. The windows were small and irregular, some covered with burlap sacks. Mallister approached the first barracks and heard low voices inside. He knocked. The voices fell silent immediately. He knocked again. "Department of Justice. I need to ask some questions." Absolute silence. Mallister waited, then slowly opened the door. It wasn't locked. but it creaked loudly on rusty hinges. The interior was dark and hot as an oven. It took seconds for his eyes to adjust. When they did, Mallister had to control his reaction. At least 15 people were crammed inside, men and women of various ages, all black, wearing what looked like rags. Improvised bunks lined the walls. A bucket served as a toilet in a corner. The smell was unbearable, a mix of sweat, urine, and despair. All stared at him with expressions Mallister couldn't fully decipher. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. Resignation, emptiness, as if they'd forgotten what it meant to expect anything from life. "My name is James Mallister," he said softly. "I'm from the federal government. I came because I received a complaint about this farm. No one here is in trouble. I just need to know the truth. Do you work here by your own choice?" No one answered. They looked at each other, then at the floor. An elderly woman, bent with age and sitting on a low bunk, finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse, as if unused for a long time. "Sir, we don't know what you want us to say." "The truth." "Just that." "Are you paid for your work?" More silence. Then a younger man, perhaps 40, thin as a stick, slowly shook his head. "We work to pay what we owe the master." "How much do you owe?" The man opened empty hands. "I don't know, sir. The master keeps the numbers." "How long have you been here?" "I was born here," said the man. "My mother too, and her mother." Mallister felt a chill down his spine despite the suffocating heat. "When was the last time you left the farm?" Blank stares. No one answered. The elderly woman coughed, a deep, wet cough. "We don't leave, sir. There's nowhere to go. The master says we owe too much. That if we leave, the sheriffs will arrest everyone for theft. That's not true. You don't owe anything worth your freedom. Do you know that slavery ended?" More silence. And then the elderly woman said something that made Mallister's blood run cold. "Ended, sir. When?" Mallister stared at them. "In 1865. 77 years ago." The expressions around him did not change to relief or surprise. They changed to confusion, as if he spoke a foreign language. "Sir," the elderly woman said slowly, "my grandfather told me Lincoln freed the slaves in the war. But old Master Turner, this one's father, he said it didn't apply here. That Georgia didn't accept those laws from the North. That we still belonged to the land." Mallister could barely believe what he was hearing. "And you believed it?" The woman looked at him with something close to pity. "Sir, we never left here. How would we know what was true? The master has guns. He has the overseers. And when someone tries to run..." She didn't finish, but her eyes moved to the floorboards. "What happens when someone tries to run?" No one answered. The silence was heavy as lead. Outside, Mallister heard footsteps approaching. The door opened abruptly. Turner entered, now accompanied by two large, muscular white men, clearly overseers. One carried a shotgun. "Agent Mallister," Turner said, his voice still calm but with a clear threat. "You're trespassing on private property and disturbing my workers. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Immediately. Mallister didn't move. "I'm going to need to speak with each of these people individually, and I'm going to need to see your payment records and contracts. Not without a warrant. Now leave, or I'll have to call Sheriff Perkins to escort you out." Mallister assessed the situation. He was alone on an isolated farm confronting 3 armed men. He had no clear jurisdiction without a warrant. And these people, who barely understood they had rights, wouldn't testify against Turner while under his control. He had to retreat. "For now," said Mallister, looking directly at Turner. "I'll be back, with a federal warrant and with marshals." Turner smiled, a cold, confident smile. "I'll be waiting, Agent. Always happy to cooperate with the law." Mallister passed by them and stepped into the sunlight. He walked back to the car, feeling every eye on the farm upon him. He got in, started the engine, and drove slowly down the dusty road. But before leaving the property completely, he stopped and looked in the rearview mirror. Turner was on the porch, watching, and Mallister realized something chilling. The man didn't look worried. He looked confident. Back in Atlanta, Mallister worked feverishly. He obtained a search warrant in 24 hours, citing suspicion of peonage and civil rights violations. He recruited 4 deputy marshals and a medical examiner. He contacted a black lawyer from Atlanta who worked on civil rights cases. He prepared everything meticulously. They returned to the Turner farm on March 21st at 5:00 in the morning, before dawn. They wanted the element of surprise, but when they arrived, the farm was strangely deserted. The main house stood empty. The barracks were empty. There was no sign of Turner, his overseers, or the workers. They searched everything. In Turner's office, they found account books showing absurd debts accumulated by people who worked there. One man owed $12,000 for accommodation and supplies over 30 years. A woman owed $8,000. The amounts were impossible to pay with the type of agricultural work they did. In the basement of the main house, they found shackles attached to a wall. Dark stains on the concrete floor looked like blood. Behind the last barracks, they found something worse. The medical examiner, a 50-year-old man named Dr. Morrison, called Mallister with a trembling voice. He was near a patch of earth that appeared recently disturbed. The soil was looser, darker than the surrounding ground. "You need to see this," Morrison said. They dug. At 30 centimeters depth, they found human bones. They continued and found more. Eventually, they unearthed the remains of at least 5 bodies, all showing signs of violent trauma. Fractured skulls, broken ribs. These were the people who had tried to escape. Mallister felt nausea rise in his throat. He stood in a clandestine cemetery in the year 1942 on American soil, looking at evidence of the systematic murder of people kept in slavery 8 decades after abolition. "Where did they go?" asked one of the marshals. "Turner and the others." Mallister didn't know, but he had a terrible suspicion. Turner had been warned. He'd had time to disappear with the people who could testify against him. And in the South of 1942, with its networks of corrupt sheriffs and sympathetic judges, a white man with money and connections could vanish very easily. Over the next 3 days, as the FBI took over the case and news began to leak to some northern newspapers, Mallister investigated frantically. He discovered Harold Turner had family in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. He discovered the farm had passed from father to son since 1840, and that the Turner family had a local reputation for being harsh with black workers. But he could not find Turner or the missing workers until March 28th. An anonymous phone call came, an elderly woman's voice trembling. She gave only an address: an abandoned barn on Route 6, 15 kilometers north of the Turner farm. Then she hung up. Mallister and the marshals got there in under 30 minutes. The barn was in ruins. Half its roof collapsed, walls rotting. It looked abandoned for years. But a truck was parked behind it, partially hidden by a pile of old hay. They entered with weapons drawn. The interior was dark and cold. Pigeons fled from the ceiling in panic. In the back, behind old stable partitions, they heard sounds, low moans, movement. They found the workers there. 23 people locked in an old granary, without food or water since they'd been moved. They were weak, desperate, terrified. Turner had hidden them, hoping the investigation would pass. But Turner wasn't with them. He had fled, leaving them to die. Mallister arranged immediate medical transport. While paramedics from Albany cared for the workers, he spoke with the elderly woman who had spoken to him before. Her name was May Louise Williams. She was 84 and told her story in a weak but clear voice. She was born in 1858 on a nearby farm. daughter of free parents who worked as sharecroppers. When she was 7, her parents died of yellow fever. A white man named Ezekiel Turner, Harold's grandfather, took her to his farm, saying he would care for her. She never left again. He told me I owed for food and shelter, said May Louise, her voice trembling but firm. Said when the debt was paid, I could go. But it never decreased, always grew. When I was 14, they put me in the fields. Cotton, corn, whatever. From sunrise to sunset. If I didn't work fast, I got the whip. She paused, eyes fixed on some distant point. Never knew about abolition. Old Turner said it didn't apply to us. Said the Georgia government didn't accept it. Said if we ran, the sheriffs would kill us or jail us for life. We couldn't read, didn't know anything of the world beyond that farm. How would we know he was lying? Mallister recorded everything. Others told similar stories. Generations born and raised on the Turner farm, passing slavery from mother to child like a hereditary curse. Some bore whip marks. A woman showed deformed fingers, broken years before, when she tried to escape and was punished. An old man had the letter T branded on his shoulder, done when he was a child. Why didn't you send that anonymous letter before? Mallister asked May Louise. Why wait so long? She looked at him with tired eyes that had seen too much suffering. Because we believed the master. But 3 months ago, one of the young ones, Thomas, he ran away at night. Went to Albany. Came back 2 days later, all beaten up, brought by the sheriff. But before he died from the beatings, he told us what he saw in town. Black people walking free, working in stores, getting paid money. He said slavery had really ended, that the master had lied to us our whole lives. Thomas died. May Louise nodded. Master Harold beat him to death, put the body in those holes behind the barracks. Said that would happen to anyone else who tried to run or talked of freedom. But I'm old, Mr. Agent. I've lived too long in this prison. Had nothing left to lose. Got a paper and pencil from the big house when nobody was looking. Wrote that letter, put it in an old envelope, and gave it to a boy who delivers supplies sometimes. Paid with the only money I ever saw in my life, a 10-cent coin I found in the mud once. Asked him to put it in the mail in Albany. Mallister looked at that elderly woman who had lived 84 years, 77 of them in illegal slavery, and felt an anger that burned like fire. Not just against Turner, but against an entire system that allowed this, against corrupt sheriffs, against neighbors who knew and did nothing, against a society that decided some lives didn't matter. The case exploded nationally. Newspapers in New York, Chicago, and Washington published the stories. Photos of the rescued workers shocked the country. The FBI expanded the investigation and discovered the Turner farm was not isolated. At least a dozen similar operations existed in the Deep South, hidden in remote places, keeping people in slavery through ignorance, fear, and violence. Harold Turner was captured 6 weeks later, trying to cross into Mexico. He was tried in federal court in Atlanta, convicted of peonage, kidnapping, forced labor, and 5 counts of murder. He received 5 consecutive life sentences. He died in the federal prison at Leavenworth in 1957, never expressing remorse. Sheriff Wade Perkins was arrested as an accomplice. It was revealed he received $50 a month from Turner to ignore the situation. He was sentenced to 20 years. The 3 rescued workers received medical care, legal assistance, and reparations from the federal government. May Louise Williams lived until 1958, exactly 100 years. She spent her last 16 years in real freedom, living in a small house in Albany that the government helped buy. She gave dozens of interviews, testified before Congress, and became a symbol of the fight against racial injustice. But the case left haunting questions. How many other farms existed? How many people still lived in captivity, hidden in places nobody looked. The investigations continued for years, revealing complex networks of modern slavery that persisted, not despite the law, but in its blind spots. Mallister continued investigating civil rights cases until retiring in 1963. He never forgot that March day in 1942, when he entered a suffocating barracks and found people who didn't know they were free. It haunted him for the rest of his life. Years later, in a documentary interview about civil rights, he said, "We think of slavery as something from the distant past, something that ended with the Civil War. But the truth is darker. Slavery didn't end because we signed a constitutional amendment. It transformed. It hid. It found ways to survive where the law didn't reach. And in some places, it didn't even transform. It just continued generation after generation, hidden behind locked gates and threats of violence." He paused, his old eyes growing distant. What haunts me isn't just the Turner's cruelty. It's how many people knew and did nothing. Neighbors who heard screams at night and closed their windows. Merchants who sold supplies to feed slaves and pretended not to know. Authorities who looked away because it was easier, or more profitable, or because they simply didn't care. Evil needs bad people to exist, but it needs indifferent people to thrive. The Turner farm was confiscated by the federal government and eventually subdivided. The main house was demolished in 1948. The barracks were burned, but the clandestine cemetery was preserved. The 5 bodies found were identified through old farm records and survivor testimony. They were properly buried in an Albany cemetery with headstones bearing their names and the words, "Finally free." In 1962, 20 years after the rescue, a memorial was erected at the site of the former Turner farm. A simple black granite stele lists the names of the 23 survivors and the 5 murdered. The inscription reads, "Freedom on paper means nothing without the courage to make it real." May Louise Williams passed peacefully in her sleep on January 23, 1958, surrounded by friends made in her years of freedom. Her funeral in Albany gathered over 300 people, including James Mallister, who traveled from Virginia to be there. In her casket, she held a framed copy of the 13th Amendment. In her will, May Louise left a letter read at the funeral. It said, "I lived 2 lives. In the first, I was property. In the second, I was a person. The first lasted longer, but the second was worth 100 years. If my story teaches one thing, let it be this: freedom is not given, not guaranteed by laws on paper. It has to be defended every day, everywhere, by people who choose to see injustice and not look away. Because when we look away, we become accomplices, and the silence of good people is what allows evil to prosper." The Turner farm case eventually inspired legal changes. Congress passed stricter laws against peonage and forced labor. The Department of Justice created a specialized civil rights division. But the changes came slowly, resisted at every step by those who benefited from the status quo. Today, few know the story of the Turner farm. It's not in most school history books. It's not taught as part of the American narrative about progress and justice. It's too uncomfortable, challenges too much the idea that slavery ended cleanly and definitively in 1865. But for those who know, it serves as a brutal reminder. Injustice doesn't simply disappear because we pass laws against it. It adapts. It hides. It waits for our complacency. And as long as there are places where the law doesn't reach, and people willing to exploit others, the fight for real freedom never ends. The Turner farm remained empty for decades. The land was bought and sold several times, but no one ever built anything permanent there. Some say the land is cursed, that it still carries echoes of the suffering it witnessed. Construction workers who tried to develop the site in the 80s reported strange sensations, disturbing dreams, the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. Perhaps it's just superstition. Or perhaps some places truly do hold memories of their horrors. What isn't superstition are the documents, the trial records, the interview transcripts, the photos of the survivors, their faces marked by decades of forced labor, but their eyes finally free. These records exist in the National Archives, available to anyone who wants to look, to anyone with the courage to face the uncomfortable truth that America was still enslaving people while it fought fascism in Europe. James Mallister kept a photo on his desk for the rest of his life. It was of May Louise Williams, taken weeks after the rescue. She's outside the Albany hospital, wearing a simple but clean donated dress, holding a Bible. She isn't smiling. Her face shows too much suffering for easy smiles. But there's something in her eyes, a light absent from the initial rescue photos. It's the light of someone who finally understood they were free. Mallister would look at that photo when his cases seemed impossible, when the weight of injustice felt too great to bear. It reminded him why the work mattered, why he couldn't give up, why every life saved, every injustice exposed, every small victory against a corrupt system was worth the fight. When Mallister died in 1974 at 74, the photo was on the table beside his bed. His son found it after the funeral and, reading the notes on the back, understood this elderly woman represented everything his father believed in. He donated the photo to the National Archives, where it remains today, a silent testament to a story America would prefer to forget. But stories like this shouldn't be forgotten. They should be told repeatedly, passed down, not to cultivate anger or guilt, but to remember vigilance. To remember that freedom is fragile, that justice isn't automatic, that progress isn't inevitable, and that sometimes in forgotten places, people still wait for someone who cares enough to look for them, to hear them, and finally to tell them the truth. They should have known since birth, you are free. You always were, and no one has the right to take that from you. The Turner farm was just one. How many others existed? How many stories remain buried, literally and figuratively? These questions have no definitive answers. But the 1942 case proved something important. That the line between past and present is thinner than we like to admit. That the ghosts of slavery weren't exorcised by a constitutional amendment. That the work of building a truly free and just society is ongoing, requiring courage, vigilance, and an absolute refusal to look the other way when confronted with evil. May Louise Williams lived 84 years, 77 in captivity, 16 in freedom. It's a terrible ratio, a brutal calculation summarizing decades of stolen life. But those last 16 years, she lived them fully. She learned to read. She voted. She traveled to Washington and saw the monuments of Lincoln and Jefferson, men who wrote of freedom while her country still denied it to her. She met grandchildren born free who would never know the whip or the constant fear that defined her existence. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time in a comfortable bed, in a house that was hers, surrounded by people who loved her, May Louise Williams died a free woman. Not as property, not as a debt in an account book, but as a human being with a name, a history, and a dignity no one could ever take from her again. That, perhaps, is the story's true victory. Not just that injustice was exposed and punished, but that those 20 people spent their final years as they should have spent their entire lives free.